All right, welcome to this week's Ronin seminar. Today we've got Josh Mitteldorf, who is going to present to us some interesting stuff about aging. And Josh, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. So I'll briefly introduce myself. I seemed, I'm an independent scientist, and I'm proud to be an independent scientist, and grateful for what Ronin has done to draw a community of independent scientists together. From early in life, it just seemed like I was destined to be a scientist, but I've also been intimidated by the scientific community along the way. As I got a PhD in physics, I just realized how many smart physicists there are out there. How can I possibly come to contribute something that all these brilliant people haven't already thought of? It was 1996 when I read something in Scientific American which really had me puzzled, and it made me think that the evolutionary community had made a mistake. I thought, how can this be? Science. I just hold science on a pedestal. That the whole scientific community could have gotten something wrong just seemed like a great opportunity to me, as well as a great improbability. So I gradually, over the next year or two, got into trying to resolve this dilemma and give my gift to the evolutionary community in a way that I thought contributed at a basic level of science, asking the question, why do we get old and die? Which is so much more compelling and first line than the kinds of questions I was asking as an astrophysicist about the propagation of radio jets in the intergalactic medium. So I've since discovered that it's not so unusual, that the science community has made lots of mistakes, that science is very political, and that's led me into all kinds of other fascinating directions. What else has the scientific community just dug in its feet in the wrong stance? Where else in the foundations of science have they got it wrong? And that's all a topic for another day or many other days. But I wanted to let you know that I am, at this point, a renegade scientist and questioning a lot of the things that scientists hold dear. Just one more word on that is reductionism. I think science has progressed and made great strides with reductionism over the last 100 years, but there's a lot that can't be explained except by systems thinking. And that's probably, in my view, the science of the future. So let me see if I can get this this video going. And that's our next presentation here. Let's see, share screen. This is the story of my lifelong quest for a long life and how I learned that natural foods weren't going to do it for me. Even as a child, I was afraid of old age and death, the great void looming at the end of life. When I was young, I had nightmares, and later, terror kept me from thinking clearly about aging and health. Cancer was scariest of all, chemical toxins in my food and the air, the water. So I ate organic, and I tried to get all the nutrients my body needed to be healthy and strong and protect itself from the onslaught of those poisons. I was 45, and all that good organic food was beginning to show around my waistline when I first read about caloric restriction. Lab mice live longer when they're starved. This isn't some kind of weird thing about mice. It works with every kind of animal they've looked at. The less you feed them, the longer they live. And it's not a small effect either. Mice that get plenty to eat live 2 years. Mice on a starvation diet, 3 years. Starving mice are more active and healthier in most every way. Well, that didn't fit with my idea about how to preserve my body for the long haul. With optimal nutrition, I'd been trying to give my body every advantage, and now it seems that optimum isn't optimum. Why is the body able to keep itself in better shape for longer when it isn't getting enough to eat? If all that extra food is so bad for me, why doesn't my body just excrete it out the back and go on to give me my longevity bonus? I discovered another hint. Other kinds of hardship also increase lifespan. This is called hormesis, and it's a controversial topic because it doesn't jibe with the usual view of aging. But it's true that extremes of heat and cold can extend lifespan in lab rats. And there are many poisons that would easily kill an animal, but small doses offer a lifespan dividend. This got me thinking about exercise in a new way. I'd always taken it for granted that exercise is good for us, but why should that be? Exercise damages muscles on a microscopic scale. Exercise saps energy that could be used for maintaining the body. And exercise generates free radicals like crazy. It sops up all those antioxidants and overwhelms them. Yet it's true. For humans, exercise is the best thing you can do for your health. And in lab experiments, running on the treadmill increases lifespan even in starving mice. With hardship and challenge, the body actually does better than if life is easy. Slowly it began to dawn on me the body is not trying to live as long as possible. Instead, there's some target lifespan, some optimum that the body is aiming for. When hard time comes, starvation or an epidemic may be killing some members of the community, those that survive are living longer to make up for it. Aging is scheduled on a clock, but it's a flexible clock. I discovered that there are genes for aging. What I mean by this is, if you delete the gene with genetic engineering, the animal lives longer. Aging genes have been discovered in every kind of animal where scientists have looked, and some of these genes seem to be common to all forms of life. The same genes that cause aging in worms also cause aging in you and me. So our bodies are not wearing out over time. They're killing themselves from the inside out. Suicide genes. The solution to one mystery is often the beginning of the next. What does that say about evolution? How can an aging gene ever evolve? Darwin talked about survival of the fittest. Well, aging is programmed death. It's the opposite of survival, the opposite of fitness. Why has nature held on to those self-destruction genes all through the long ride from worms to mammals? This is a paradox, a scientific challenge. It kept me busy for 5 years. Now I think I have an answer, and it has surprising implications for how we can optimize our own prospects for longevity. All that natural food, those vitamin pills were just a detour. Is it obvious yet that a natural lifestyle can't help you live longer? Here's a hint. Natural foods can only help the body do better what it has already evolved to do well. And if our bodies are evolved for self-destruction, well, we're going to need a different approach. It's a new way to think, probably as unfamiliar to you as it was to me. You can read more about the evolutionary medicine of aging here on my blog page. But for the whole story, it's all in this book. So as you saw, I became aware of a scientific conundrum in 1996 as I read an article in Scientific American that said that the less you feed animals, the longer they live. And I thought, well, what can an animal do when it's starved that it can't do when it has plenty of food? I mean, it's always at liberty to just not use the food or to eat less. And when I realized that it was so many animals that were adapted that way, I thought, this only makes sense if aging is an adaptation. And I thought, well, how do evolutionary biologists think about aging? Do they think of it as an adaptation? And what I heard from a lot of evolutionary biologists who I made contact with in the early days of the internet was that it was just ridiculous to think that that aging could be an adaptation. So here's a quote from a Scientific American article a few years later, and 2004, the way evolution works makes it impossible for us to possess genes that are specifically designed to cause physiological decline with age or to control how long we live. And yes, this is bedrock evolutionary theory. In the standard way of thinking about Darwinian fitness, there are two components. There's survival and there's reproduction. Survival, well, aging gradually reduces all your capacity to compete for space in the niche, your strength, your endurance, and reproduction, the ultimate measure of your evolutionary fitness is how many offspring you produce and how quickly you produce them. Well, fertility declines with aging, and then death cuts off your opportunity to reproduce altogether. So there's no question that from a fitness point of view, aging is a negative. It only detracts from your fitness. Aging should be selected against in any reasonable theory of Darwinian evolution. But when we look at the evidence, we find that, in fact, there's strong evidence that aging has evolved as an adaptation. Well, how do we know this? There are three ways. One is hormesis. If you thought that aging was just something that happened to us, then you'd figure, well, the harder the environment, the shorter you live. But the opposite is true. As I talked about caloric restriction, which is the most robust way to make animals live longer in the lab. But exercise is also something, you don't think of it that way, but exercise is a hardship. It damages muscles, it makes micro cracks in bones, it raises the level of reactive oxygen species, ROS. And yet exercise increases lifespan. In lab tests, even toxins, they feed small amounts of chloroform to dogs, and the dogs live longer. Radiation, a lot of radiation can kill you, but a little radiation makes you live longer. They've done experiments with heat and cold stress on everything from worms to mice. And in moderation, stresses make the body live longer. Now, that only makes sense if the body is trying to live a certain age and perhaps living longer when it detects a hard environment. Well, others are dying of these hardships, so maybe it's better to cut out the program for a short lifespan and allow myself to live longer. This is really the only way to think about hormesis. The second way we know that aging is an adaptation is that there are genes for aging. It was first discovered, and it was a big surprise. There was a gene called AGE1 discovered by Thomas Johnson. You delete the gene and the worm lives half again as long. You delete two copies of the gene. It was discovered decades later that you delete both copies of the gene, and the animal lives 10 times as long. Everything is slowed down, but the worm extends its lifespan from a couple of weeks to 6 months. A few years later, in Cynthia Kention's lab in California, the DAF2 gene was discovered. There's a disabled form of DAF2 that's weaker, but still slightly active. And these DAF2 mutant worms lived twice as long as other worms. So this is not adding something to the genome. This is not giving the animal some advantage. It's disabling a gene that the animal has had for a long time. And that's what makes the animal live longer. If there are aging genes, and this seems to be direct evidence that evolution has selected for them. The other genes, there's a gene called INDI for I'm not dead yet, discovered in fruit flies. You delete the gene, the fly lives longer. There's a gene called P66 SHC. You disable it in mice, and the mice live longer. And growth hormone, curiously enough, if you disable the growth hormone gene. So here's a picture I found in the New York Times, I think. Laron syndrome is common in some countries, some parts of Ecuador. It's a growth hormone gene defect, and the people uh, don't grow very tall, but they live a long time. They never get cancer. They never get diabetes without this growth hormone gene. So the third reason that we know that aging is an adaptation is that the genes that are related to aging are very old. They've been around for at least 500 million years, maybe more than that, because they're common. We find the same genes or related genes that regulate aging in humans and mice, and also in worms and in yeast cells. So the way to interpret this is, if there's a gene that both humans and yeast cells have, it must have come from our last common ancestor. And that was 1 billion years ago, that there existed a being from which both yeast cells and humans descended. That was 1 billion years ago. Somehow, these genes that regulate aging have been kept around for that long by evolution. It's not a mistake. Evolution must have wanted those genes there. So this is the conundrum in black and white. It's obvious from evolutionary theory that aging is the opposite of adaptive, the opposite of fitness. And yet there are these lines of reasoning from genetics and demography that tell us that aging looks like other things that are adaptive. It looks like evolution wants us to die. And now we get to the point where I promised to open the floor to, what do you think of this? Does this seem like a conundrum to you? How do you think about aging? Can you propose solutions? The floor is yours.